everyone, and welcome to Walking Through the Bible. When we left off in our study of Ezra, we're in about 457 BC. Ezra has returned from captivity with a small remnant to check on the previously freed captives who had been freed about 80 years earlier. What he found was a nation that had defiled itself by the taking of pagan wives contrary to the law of Moses. Israel corrected this by putting off their foreign wives. As we come to Nehemiah now, we're going to find that we have advanced about 12 to 13 years into the future. Artaxerxes was still ruler over Persia. Ezra seems to still be in Judea because we'll see him later on in this book. But what is going on there? Is Israel prospering or are there problems? Let's find out. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Nehemiah chapter 1. We're going to be reading from verses 1 to 11. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry, just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, Nehemiah chapter 1, beginning at verse 1. The words of Nehemiah the son of Hakaliah. It came to pass in the month of Chislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brethren, came with men from Judah. And I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had survived the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the survivors who are left from the captivity in the province are there in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. So it was, when I heard these words, that I sat down and wept and mourned for many days. I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And I said, I pray, Lord God of heaven, O great and awesome God, you who keep your covenant and mercy with those who love you and observe your commandments, please let your ear be attentive and your eyes open, that you may hear the prayer of your servant, which I pray before you now, day and night, for the children of Israel, your servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Both my father's house and I have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you, and have not kept the commandments, the statutes, nor the ordinances which you commanded your servant Moses. Remember, I pray, the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though some of you were cast out to the farthest part of the heavens, yet I will gather them from there and bring them to the place which I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. Now these are your servants and your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. O Lord, I pray, please let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who desire to fear your name. And let your servant prosper this day, I pray, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. For I was the king's cupbearer. The setting from the end of the book of Ezra has changed. We are no longer situated in Jerusalem, but now are back within the heart of Persian territory. The exact city in the New King James is called Shushan the citadel, but in other translations it is referred to as Susa. Susa was one of the several royal cities built by the Persians, with the others being Ecbatana, Persepolis, and Parsagadai. This Susa is the same setting as the book of Esther, and is where Daniel would see his vision of the ram with the two horns in Daniel 8. Today, the city of Susa would be located within the borders of Iran. As we said earlier, we've also advanced about 13 years from the end of the book of Ezra during the 20th year of the reign of Artaxerxes Longimanus, meaning that at the time of Nehemiah, the Jews in Judea should have been doing much better, though we'll see in a moment why they were not. The month is Chislev, which is the 9th month in the Jewish calendar, corresponding to our mid-November to mid-December. Nehemiah himself was one of the king's servants, being among the cupbearers. This meant that he would have access to the king, something that will be important later. What happened in the month of Chislev this year that would change Nehemiah's life forever? Well, when his brother Hanani, who we will find out in chapter 7 is his actual brother, came to Nehemiah with some news from Judah, with some Jews from Judah, Nehemiah found out that the state of affairs in Judah were not going well. The people who had returned had, yes, rebuilt the temple almost 75 years before, but the walls of Jerusalem had yet to be rebuilt. Now, there is some disagreement as to whether what is being described here is that the Jews rebuilt the wall in Jerusalem and it was recently torn down, or whether the wall had never been rebuilt since Nebuchadnezzar tore it down almost a century and a half prior. We can sort of get a hint as to which view was right by going back and rereading the book of Ezra. Let's turn to Ezra chapter 4 and read verse 12 and then 23 and 24. Let it be known to the king that the Jews who came up from you come to us at Jerusalem and are building the rebellious and evil city and are finishing its walls and repairing the foundations. Skipping to verse 23. Now when the copy of King Artaxerxes' letter was read before Rehum, Shimshai the scribe, and their companions, they went up in haste to Jerusalem against the Jews, and by force of arms made them cease. Thus the work of the house of God, which is at Jerusalem, ceased, and it was discontinued until the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. It should be noted that the Artaxerxes there in Ezra 4 is a different person than the Artaxerxes here in Nehemiah, but I would like you to note the language used. What was being complained about by the enemies of the Jews? The building of the temple and the walls. What was stopped? Specifically, the temple is said to be stopped, but we can easily infer that the rebuilding of the walls were stopped too, since that was included in the letter to Artaxerxes. When we see Darius reverse the order, we only see that the temple was rebuilt. Nothing is said about the walls of Jerusalem. Might they have been rebuilt too? Perhaps, but it was hard enough to get the Jews to rebuild the temple, so it's very easy to understand why the walls hadn't been rebuilt. Now, wouldn't Nehemiah have known this about the wall in Jerusalem before being told, seeing as how the Jews had been in Jerusalem for almost a century by this point? My question is, how? Nehemiah was very likely born in Persia, to a family that didn't return to Judah. He grew up a Jew, but then was employed in the king's house. He therefore wouldn't know all the goings-on in Judah unless it was told to him. Furthermore, if the people surrounding the Jews hadn't been distressing them, the lack of a wall in Jerusalem would pose no real concern. But since these peoples were distressing the Jews, this lack of a wall was a real problem. And with the problem now set before him, Nehemiah fell down and wept for many days, something that included fasting and prayer. Why? Because he knew that all was not right with the hearts of the children of Israel. In other words, they were in sin. How could Nehemiah conclude this? Because the children of Israel were being oppressed. All the way throughout our studies of the Old Testament, we have seen that when the children of Israel did right, God was with them. But when they did evil, God was against them and caused them to be oppressed by others. God had told Israel this in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, something that Nehemiah refers to here in his prayer. So the only logical conclusion is that Israel was in sin, a sin that had its root in the failure to fully rebuild and fortify Jerusalem, the city in which the temple was located in. Remember from our past studies that the wall of Jerusalem didn't just surround where people lived. It surrounded the temple too. So if the wall wasn't rebuilt, the temple itself stood vulnerable. Nehemiah was so disturbed by Israel's condition that he even attributed the sins of the people to himself, even though he wasn't there. In all this, Nehemiah was pleading with God, who keeps his covenants and shows mercy to those who love him and keep his commandments, to hear his prayer, seeking deliverance for Israel and the forgiveness of their sins. In this, Nehemiah's prayer sounded an awful lot like Solomon's prayer to God, where in 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 30, here's what Solomon said. And may you hear the supplication of your servant and of your people Israel, when they pray towards this place, here in heaven your dwelling place, and when you hear, forgive. Nehemiah was doing exactly what Solomon called on him to do, and through his prayer, Nehemiah was interceding on Israel's behalf. Now, God wasn't obligated to hear and answer Nehemiah's prayer, for he is God. But God is a loving God. He hears the prayers of the righteous people like Nehemiah. We're going to see how God answers Nehemiah's prayer later on in this book. But first and foremost, Nehemiah needed to entreat King Artaxerxes to let him go to Jerusalem in the first place. And for that, too, Nehemiah prayed to God for assistance. In all of this, we see the humility of Nehemiah. Nehemiah didn't try to find excuses for Israel or call God unjust for allowing Israel to be distressed because of their sins. No, he praised and honored God for who he is, accepted responsibility and punishment for the failings of the people, and yet humbly pled for God's mercy. We'll begin to see God's mercy and providence in action, beginning, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 1 to 10, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. We thank you for watching Walking Through the Bible today. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them below. But if you like this video, we ask that you consider subscribing to our channel so you won't miss out on other videos in our series, as well as share this video among your friends so that the saving message of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.